Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 10 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have lost 5-3. So now the third straight game for the San Jose Sharks where they were missing a bunch of NHL regulars. Still nobody really returning at all from the COVID protocol. So the Sharks running with a pretty Shark-Akuda, as I've heard it called, type of lineup for this game. And while that magic managed to carry them through the two previous games against the Jets and the Buffalo Sabres, the magic definitely started to run out here in this one against the St. Louis Blues. And even though the Sharks did end up keeping it close on the scoreboard, ignoring the empty net, this was a one-goal game. In the end, I'd say it was pretty clear that the St. Louis Blues were the better team tonight for this game. Now, this one started off kind of strangely in the first period. The Blues would get the first power play of this game, but then would quickly take two minor penalties, as Buchnevich would get called for, I believe, boarding, and then Tarasenko called for unsportsmanlike conduct, and quickly the Sharks would end up on the 4-on-3. The Blues would then get called again for another penalty, a double minor, so 4 minutes in the box, and the Sharks would end up with a 4-on-3 that would then lead into a 5-on-3. So the Sharks with glorious opportunities to be able to take a large lead in this game, and they would get one goal from Brent Burns on the power play, but the only other goal scored on this long period of time that the Sharks had this massive advantage was actually by the Blues' shorthanded Brandon Saad, and so it was a 1-1 game at around the halfway mark of this period. The Sharks would eventually get one back in this first 20-minute frame, as Logan Couture would get a shorthanded goal of his own, and so the Sharks would quite surprisingly carry a one-goal lead going into the second period. In the second period, however, is where the Blues started to take over a bit. They would quickly get the tying goal from Buchnevich to make it 2-2. The Sharks would answer back with Nick Merkley, his first as a Shark, to make it 3-2 San Jose and take that lead back, but that would be the last lead the Sharks would hold in this game. The Blues would end up tying it up on another Brandon Saad goal to make it 3-3, and James Neal would get the first Blues lead of the game with his one in that period, the final goal of that second period, to make it 4-3. And in the third period, I talked about in the previous game against the Buffalo Sabres that the Sharks had put up a very solid third period. They pushed the pace, they did all of the right things to be able to not only expand on the lead, but to close out that game. But here tonight, while they were trailing one goal, it was the exact opposite. The Sharks just didn't really put the pedal to the metal. There was no real drive here to be able to tie up this game. The Blues just sort of controlled what the Sharks could do, and nobody really stepped up at all for San Jose, and so they kind of just went quietly into this loss and would end up getting an empty netter scored against them by Rob Thomas, and the Blues would win 5-3. In a glass half full type of perspective, as I mentioned earlier on in this review, you can look at this as the Sharks are missing a ton of NHL regulars, and they were against one of the best teams in the NHL in the St. Louis Blues, one of the highest scoring teams in the NHL, and they played them relatively close on the scoreboard, and so a 5-3 loss really isn't the worst thing in the world. However, you can also look at this from a glass half empty perspective, where this was a very winnable game, I would say, but in the end, the Sharks, a few reviews ago, I talked about how that game against Nashville was the Sharks game in which the Sharks managed the puck the worst, their worst game of the season in terms of puck management. Well, we have a new leader in that category, because here tonight, the Sharks were all sorts of sloppy with the puck and just continuously gave it away to the Blues in the defensive zone. They're lucky that they only ended up scoring 4 goals, because the Blues just had trouble finishing on multiple golden opportunities that the Sharks kind of handed to them on a silver platter. So from the glass half empty perspective, this was a winnable game because of the scoreboard, but it was just kind of disastrous in their own defensive zone. As we move on to the players, at the first line, we have Couture, Eklund, and Dahlin, probably the worst that we've seen from most of these players. Eklund, I guess you could say, was half decent and not necessarily worse than we've seen him before. I thought this was Dahlin's most ineffective game at the NHL level, which is going to eventually happen in a full 82-game season grind. It's very difficult to maintain such a high level of play, and so this was Dahlin's real first down game. To get back to Eklund, however, this is obviously a very important game for him because this was his 9th game of the season. So the major question is now whether or not Eklund will remain with the San Jose Sharks and as such burn a year on his entry-level deal and really commit himself to San Jose, because it'd be kind of strange to eventually end up sending him down, or the Sharks have the option to put him back or not put him back, but just to send him down to the AHL and potentially even send him back to Sweden if they really want to do that and avoid burning that first year of his entry-level deal. The entire subject is kind of something that you would talk about in a full other video, as I can't really get into it in this review, but it's definitely an interesting decision that Doug Wilson has to make, and that he also has to be factoring in Bob Booner, or I guess John McLean at this point, since Bob Booner is also on COVID protocol, because if you're in a situation where you're going to plan to play Eklund barely getting 10 to 11 minutes a night, you would want to send him down, but if you feel as though he's going to make an impact and you're going to give him the opportunity to make an impact, it's likely better to keep him up. So as I said, kind of a topic for a different video, but it was a very pivotal game for Eklund. And when it comes to Couture, I felt like he was probably the best player on this top line, but still, that's not really necessarily saying much. There just wasn't really much cohesion between these three players, which is a bit odd to see because Couture and Dahlin in previous games had so much synergy between themselves. On to the second line, probably the most disappointing line of this game. The best player who stood out for me on this trio of players was probably Barabanov. I felt like he had a couple of very slick plays in the offensive zone, definitely showed off some decent skill, but all in all didn't really have a great game. I think the biggest disappointment on the line and potentially in this entire game was Tomas Hertl. Hertl's start to the season hasn't necessarily been that great. He's had a couple of good games, a couple of bad games. All in all has been maybe slightly above average, but this past game against the Buffalo Sabres felt like it should have been the turning point for Tomas Hertl. He was the most dominant player on the ice in that game against Buffalo, so it felt as though he would be able to carry that momentum forward, and yet here tonight, not only was he rather invisible, but he was also at times a liability for the San Jose Sharks, being a big part of that poor puck management skills that I talked about earlier. So definitely a very disappointing game from Tomas Hertl. And then when it comes to Rudolf Balcers, he's not necessarily the type of player who's going to drive a line really hard, and as such, when the fact is that his line mates, especially Tomas Hertl, aren't doing particularly well, Balcers isn't necessarily going to look all that well himself. So I didn't think this was an awful game from Balcers. There weren't any glaring errors that he made in this one, but he also didn't really stand out in a positive way. On to the third line, where we had a bit of a new look. Nick Merkley, who manages to still stick in the lineup here for the San Jose Sharks, playing in all three games since the Sharks had that major, COVID protocol issue. And he's now found himself on the third line with Bonino and Cogliano, and even managed to score a goal in this game. So that's rather impressive for Nick Merkley, who hasn't been, far and away an outstanding player for the San Jose Sharks in either of these three games that he has played, but he has been just solid enough to be impressive in the bottom six for the Sharks coaching staff. When it comes to Bonino and Cogliano, I've talked about these players so much over these past few games, always discussing what they've been bringing to the table, or I guess you could say what they haven't been bringing to the table, and so just going over them once more would make me just sound like a broken record at this point, so I'll let you guys know when something actually changes on the Bonino and Cogliano front, because this game definitely didn't change much of anything for my opinion about those two players. But finally, we arrive at the Sharks' fourth line, which was likely the best line for the San Jose Sharks, which I guess is not usually a great sign for a team in a game, but Gadjevich, Weatherby, and Peterson worked rather well together. Gadjevich found himself back into the lineup here. He has been taken in and out of the lineup a few times so far this season, which has always surprised me because every time he's in the lineup, he's actually been a pretty decent player for the San Jose Sharks, but he comes in instead of John Leonard and actually makes a couple of very nice plays. As I said, this was the Sharks' best line of the game. Weatherby himself was also very, very solid. Peterson maybe the slight odd man out on this line. I didn't think Peterson did a ton, but he certainly wasn't bad either. And so this fourth line, they didn't score a goal for the San Jose Sharks, but they definitely drove play in the correct direction for them and was probably the most defensively responsible, at least in terms of turnovers, for the Sharks. So as I said, probably not the greatest sign, but at the very least, if this is a fourth line, you maybe want to try and keep together, because these are four players that will still be with the San Jose Sharks and up with the roster even when all the normal players come back into the lineup. That could technically be something the Sharks could do. On to the defensive side is where we really had many of the main issues for the San Jose Sharks. In the couple of previous games, I talked about how Ferraro and Burns had needed to step up, and they actually did in those 2 games. Here tonight, though, maybe not as much. Felt like as though while they were making some okay plays offensively in the offensive zone, they were very sloppy with the puck. In particular, Mario Ferraro, just in the last few minutes of this third period, gave the puck away a good 3 or 4 times in very, very dangerous situations. So just some poor puck management, as was kind of been the theme for the San Jose Sharks in this game. They'll hopefully rebound, but as we move on to really the more interesting topic in this game, it is of course these 4 bottom defensemen here that have come up from the San Jose Barracuda and have played all of these games. Well, I shouldn't say they've all played all of these games, because there was another new face for the San Jose Sharks as Santeri Hatakka was injured in the previous game against the Buffalo Sabres. It was Artemi Kniazev getting his first NHL game, and honestly, Kniazev didn't look half bad. Actually made a few nice moves in the offensive zone, wasn't completely terrible defensively, wasn't the main culprit for a lot of these terrible defensive zone turnovers. And so honestly, if there was going to be a slow trickle in of some of these other Sharks players to come back from COVID protocol, so for instance, if let's say just Jacob Middleton was available to play in this upcoming game against the New Jersey Devils on Saturday, I would wager that Artemi Kniazev has done enough in this game to actually keep a spot in the lineup. Obviously, if all 4 Sharks defensemen were to come back, Kniazev would end up back with the Barracuda, but he actually did not look too bad in this first game. His defensive partner Nick Milosh, however, definitely did not escape any sort of criticism for this one. Milosh was very hard to watch at times in this game. He was the one who made a pretty big mistake on this James Neal goal, which would eventually take that lead for the Blues, that the Blues would never end up relinquishing in this game. So a bit of a rough one for Nick Milosh, to say the least. So if, as I said, a player like Jacob Middleton were to return in the lineup, he would be my choice to probably just come out of it. On the last pairing, we of course have Megna and Merkley. I talked a lot about Megna in the previous game against the Buffalo Sabres because he had played almost 24 minutes in that one, and I was saying, oh, Megna could be a player who could even stick around. Well, maybe not so much. This was definitely a bit of a fall from grace for Jacob Megna. He also got 8 less minutes here tonight than he did in the previous game against the Buffalo Sabres. And while I felt like he started off decently well, he hit a massive rough patch, I would say, about halfway through this game where he just looked like a completely different player. So I wasn't super impressed with Megna. And if there's really anything that I've learned from this game, I'm not sure if all the Sharks players will be back on for that game on Saturday, but if there's anything I've learned, it's that while we can toy around with the fact that you want to bench a player like Vlasic and Shemek and bring in someone more young from the Barracuda, it seems likely that we're just going to see the return of the usual 6 defensemen once everyone is healthy again. And finally, there is of course Ryan Merkley, who at the very least, I will say one positive about it compared to the game against the Winnipeg Jets, where he also looked not particularly strong, but also looked very disengaged in that one. The one positive here is that I felt as though Ryan Merkley definitely looked quite engaged with this game, certainly seemed to be putting in, his best effort and trying. However, his best effort wasn't nearly good enough in this one. He also was a major culprit of a lot of the defensive zone turnovers, similar to Milosh. He had a lot of tough shifts in the defensive zone where he just got caught out, had opportunities to clear the puck out, but then certainly was unable to do so, held the puck for just a couple seconds too long, and he would end up getting punished with that. And so while I liked the effort, it wasn't a great game all around for Ryan Merkley. And finally, we arrive at the Sharks goaltender. That is, of course, Adin Hill for this game, or maybe I should just call him Martin Jones, because this was peak Martin Jones performance from Adin Hill here tonight. If I were to just show you a highlight reel of the saves that Adin Hill made in this game, you'd say, wow, Hill was clearly on point, making such great saves. I'm sure he stole that game away from the Blues for the San Jose Sharks, and you would be right in saying that from the saves. But then when you were to add in the highlight reel of these goals that he let in, you would kind of be singing a different tune. Now, there's this first goal from Brandon Saad shorthanded that he had essentially no chance on. This was a 2-on-1 and a very well-placed shot from Brandon Saad. But it is the other 3 goals that he let in that have left a lot to be desired. The first one here from Buchnevich, of course, of terrible defensive zone breakdown for the San Jose Sharks, which, as I've mentioned multiple times, was a theme here tonight. But this was also one that Adin Hill should have been able to make the save on, and you can tell how frustrated he actually was when he let in this goal because he showed that frustration on the ice. Then when it comes to the second Brandon Saad goal, a very nice shot from Brandon Saad, but from rather far out with 0 traffic in front because it was on the rush, and yet Hill just not really playing the angle right. This was, of all of the goals let in here tonight, this was probably the most peak Martin Jones of them all because it's on the blocker side and everything like that. And then this James Neal one, again, terrible defensive zone coverage for the San Jose Sharks, mistakes from basically everyone on this shift. But the fact is that this is a shot from the point that Hill should be able to either absorb and, get the freeze on it, or at least be able to kick the rebound away very safely into the corner. But instead, he kicks the rebound right in front to James Neal, who's then able to, all alone, push this puck in past Adin Hill. So it's not necessarily the goal, the fact that he let in that goal to James Neal, but it's the fact that James Neal ever even got this puck that was Adin Hill's fault. So these last 3 goals in this game, not at all looking good for Adin Hill. And so for Hill, whose kind of starting job has been threatened over these past couple of games by James Reimer, who's looked significantly better than him, this was a game to try and get some redemption against a very, very strong St. Louis team, and he hasn't really done that. So I thought Reimer would end up getting the start here tonight, but McLean decides to go back to Adin Hill, and that may have ended up being a mistake here for McLean, and it'll be very surprising if he ends up not going back to Reimer for the upcoming game for the Sharks. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday. They will take on the New Jersey Devils. Should be a bit of an easier opponent than the St. Louis Blues were, but the Devils have actually looked pretty good thus far this season, I would say. Very young team, very hungry team, so the Sharks could technically still have, their hands full with that team, especially if the Sharks are still as shorthanded as they have been this past week. Class dismissed.